Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk a little bit about the behavior of complex systems of various types, like physical ones, economic, social, political, etc., like life in general as a complex system. So these types of systems often demonstrate various irregular types of behavior, like chaotic behavior, like catastrophes and cycles and whatever, all those kinds of nonlinear phenomena. By the way, I have a video specifically about nonlinear phenomena called Nonlinearities and Time. So look it up if you wish. But anyway, what I'm going to be focusing in this video in particular is that the fact, or at least the observation, that these complex behaviors that are observed in all those previously mentioned kinds of systems are often being the result of really very simple forces acting in those systems, right? So more often than not, complexity arises as the result of actually simplicity. Perhaps like, well, let's say a manifestation of simple rules, of a very limited set of simple rules through the environment. It creates all these complex patterns that we observe further, right? So we arrive at the complex picture that we can perceive. And by the way, there's specifically one point I wanted to mention here with regards to that is about fractals. Like people, especially again in this electric universe community, etc., they like to say that fractals are like basically, how do you say it? Well, basically fractals are only arise due to electric forces, right? Whereas I would claim that no, they're not, or at least not only, because I would actually make a strong statement that any sort of iterative process can produce fractals. Not necessarily does produce fractals, but it definitely can. Again, any iterative process. And if you look at well, again, think about the coastline, like this quasi-fractal shape of coastlines. It's produced through iterative application of the water erosion or wind erosion, right? Same with like mountain shapes. Why are they so kind of Lichtenberg-esque, right? It's again because of iterative application of erosional forces. And even if you ever worked with mathematical fractals, or what people call prefractals. I'm not sure if it's the correct English term, but in Russian we call it prefractals. Well, like the Sierpinski's carpet and things like that. So, or Koch's snowflake. So you always apply an iterative procedure to generate these fractals, right? So let's say, I think it's abelian set or something, or counter set, I don't exactly remember. So you have like a line, then you subdivide it in a special way, like make a hole in it basically, and then you apply the same operation to those smaller things that you get, and then to each one of the resulting ones, etc., etc., and you get this quasi-fractal structure. So again, it's this iterative process that's generating these fractals. So again, it's an example of what I'm talking about in this video. A simple rule set generating complex picture in the end, right? Just applied iteratively in this particular case at the very least. So yeah, any sort of iterative process can create fractals. That's one other point I wanted to specifically make here. All right, so we can see that oftentimes, when we observe this chaotic behavior, this sort of boiling of stuff, roughly speaking, I don't know, it's just a super stupid abstract analogy, we can perhaps recognize, at least sometimes, these vague tendencies behind this process, right? So, roughly speaking, we have a graph that goes like this, but we see that, oh, wait a minute, it actually kind of slowly rises on top of it all. Like if we remove this chaotic noise, right? So there is some simple, straightforward underlying process which has a very definite direction to it, right? And you can recognize these patterns in many areas, again, in stock market ratings, or how do you call it, like prices of a certain index, let's say, where, again, you have a very chaotic behavior, etc., blah, blah, blah. But, for example, you have a central bank which emits money constantly, which makes all the indices grow on average, like on large periods of time, right? So that's why, again, stock market people call the buying the long position, right? Because it is assumed by almost by default, by definition, that in the long run everything would rise, right? Because, again, there's always new money being injected, and some of this money is going into this particular how do you call it, stock market portfolio or whatever. All right, so actually most of the money that is being produced end up on stock market, but that's a whole separate story. So, and in life you can certainly observe similar tendencies. Like, you might think of like personal stories, like let's say people from broken families, like really unhappy families, like where parents are alcoholic or there's only a single mother or single father. They tend to be screwed up in the long term, you know, so there's a much higher probability that such a person raised in such a family would become really unhappy and would either end up doing drugs or become a criminal or some stuff like that. Like a lot of like prostitutes and porn actresses come from families like that, etc., and criminals, of course. Okay, so again, we observe this large-scale tendency that unhappy family kind of puts you onto this trajectory where you're going down eventually, right? Even if at some point in life you're actually going up, it might be only a fluke, you know. It might end pretty bad in the long-term perspective, but it's not guaranteed, of course. I mean, there are always outliers, but who knows? And there's another point I wanted to make here, is about what Schroedinger talked about life in particular. Like, I've already mentioned this in my video, one of them, Onion of Aliens. I think it was part 1, where I talked about life in general. So Schroedinger was sort of amazed in his book. He expresses amazement at how life looks almost inertial in some sense, like throughout all the chaos that we have in life. I mean, in life in like broader biological sense, not in personal sense. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of all kinds of processes influencing a single organism, and yet somehow life still goes on, you know, life again in biological sense. So it almost looks like this transfer of genes is almost like a very mechanistical act, which kind of happens almost without any hindrance, almost like it was heavily lubricated, so to speak. So it was almost like a pendulum swinging back and forth without any thermal losses or whatever, the dispersive forces. So yeah, and this again kind of demonstrates this sort of larger scale tendency in life. Like, again, there's all kinds of chaos and tragedy and other stuff in all organisms on this planet at the very least, but somehow through all of this they kind of continue on and evolution goes on, etc., etc., and it all looks like you know, a life of a single, again, cell, single organism doesn't even matter in the large scheme of things. There's still this crawling, slow but very powerful tendency towards whatever you wish to call it, evolution or whatever, right? So all this noise on top of it doesn't really matter that much. And And again, in society, you certainly can see processes akin to those things. Okay, so this was primarily what I wanted to talk about in this video. That, okay, again, I'll repeat that in conclusions, but some more illustrations perhaps would help. And one thing I was thinking about with respect to this topic was TV series, actually. Again, I've mentioned already that TV series are very important for modern culture. Again, they're sort of like our version of, long novels of the past. Like if you think about Tolstoy or Moby Dick or, things like that, like huge voluminous works where people were basically like biding their time reading them, right? So this is what we're doing with our TV series. Like, it's actually very hard to read most of those things, exactly because they weren't really made to, convey some message, at least not necessarily. There are many messages perhaps spread out throughout the whole thing, but the main idea was basically to kind of create this space for you to go in when you have spare time and you just want to amuse yourself a little bit, right? So it's kind of, they're by design are made sort of like boring a little bit, at least, right? Because it's a place to stay rather than a funny activity, something like that, in cultural sense. And today's TV series are much like that, and at least some of them, like, there are again outliers probably, but there are very, very definitive, let's say, genres of TV series which fall into this category that I've just described. And for example, sitcoms are a very characteristic example of that, where you have basically, again, a space, right? A sitcom, it's basically, it revolves around some room or something like that, where just people sit and talk, right? Or something like that. And of course, some stuff happens, like they leave the room, they go back, etc., etc. But ultimately, it's just a place for you to be in, to bide your time, right? Something like that. And even the design of their episodes is revolving around that you cannot really progress the plot. There is really no plot, in some sense. So you have to kind of circle it back each episode to this ground zero, so to speak, right? So you have all kinds of chaos in each episode, but it should end up in the very same point, or at least on the same very slow trajectory that we talked about, like this simple thing behind the complexity. So yeah, and in general, like, again, any TV series, like any episode in itself might be like super dramatic, there might be all kinds of things going on, but ultimately it doesn't add to the previous episode that much, usually at least. So again, the plot progresses really slowly. So it's this larger trend behind the complex, very simple one, usually. Again, it may be like a resolution of some fundamental conflict, or something to that effect, a fundamental conflict, usually, associated with the main character, etc., etc. All right, I think I've talked enough about this. Yeah, I may have also wanted to note that it actually is like life in some sense, like all those TV series, because, well, in the sense that they have no end. I've already stated in one of my aphorisms that the true tragedy of life is that it has no end. Life can be there, or it can not be there. So there's no life, but there's no end to life. And this is the true horror of life. Like, you can switch your TV series off, but you cannot switch your life off. You can die, yeah, but ultimately you would just transition from, well, okay, let's just leave it at this poetic thing that life is tragic because it has no end. Like, there may be life, there may be no life, but ultimately life has no end. Okay. Well, I guess I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to talk about. Another analogy I can think of is, well, it might be pretty stupid, but it's this, again, electric current, for example, like how electric current flows through the wire. You're probably aware that the actual speed, or actual velocity of electrons carrying the current is very small, right? It's like millimeters per second. Whereas chaotic motion of electrons in the conductor is very high. Like, I'm not sure what are the velocities, but they're huge compared to this drift velocity. So we have this, again, chaotically moving electrons, like really, really fast, still carrying this current really, really slowly drifting, like literally at roughly this speed, right? So, so it's, again, this slower but larger trend underlying the complex chaotic behavior. Something like that. And moving even closer to the conclusions I wish to mention here, like, all right, this is one aspect of the thing. Like, when we, let's say, observe complex chaotic behavior on smaller scales and a very simple behavior on larger scales, like very simple, like strong trend in, let's say, or just stability overall. But what if we kind of expand our focus even more outwards, right? What if we look at a larger picture? Maybe this larger trend is also like only like a fluke in a chaos of a higher order, let's say, right? So we have a chaos on smaller scale. If we zoom out, we get like a steady trend. If we zoom out even more, this steady trend becomes only one speck in a higher order chaos. Then we may zoom out even more and we get a larger trend. So basically, again, this fractal kind of thing, maybe it happens. Like, again, we're talking in a very abstract sense, so I'm not really talking about anything in particular. And it is indeed the case in the most general case, I would claim, because, again, cycles within cycles, I mean. So basically, you're, let's say, observing an upward trend in a smaller cycle, but still larger cycle is in the downward trend, and even larger cycle is again in the upward trend, and even larger cycle is maybe in its dormant phase, so to speak. So this indeed happens always, because whatever you look at, like whatever the parameter you're describing the system with, this parameter, if it can be at least numerically depicted, it can be dissolved into Fourier series. And what is Fourier series? It's cycles. It's a bunch of cycles, a combination of cycles with different periods, different amplitudes, etc. So indeed, yes, any process can be described as a combination of cycles. This is indeed the case. And well, I guess that's it, pretty much. So, in this sense, this notion, and again, like Ptolemaic system, those epicycles, it was basically an example of Fourier decomposition, right? So, what was later recognized as Fourier decomposition. But anyway, so, yeah, well, that's pretty much it. So, in some sense, this point is trivial, because it doesn't add anything to what we know. But it's one way of looking at things, that indeed you can recognize many cycles nested within each other and describe the whatever happening to you or to the society or to the universe through it, even though it actually doesn't really reveal anything fundamental about the universe. It's just a way of description of it. All right. And with regards to that, I wish to make another note here, for which I wish to mention Ekaterina Shulman here again, a Russian politologist who kind of mentions this frequently in her talks. So it's this, when we're talking about larger trend and recognition of smaller patterns on top of it. So again, we're talking about like why do these smaller, or rather, well, this chaotic motion even is recognized? Well, because we have this dormant sort of, or quasi-dormant, how do you say it? Not the bottom line, but baseline, I guess, right? So you can recognize these processes with respect to some baseline. So what I'm saying in particular, and what she says, is that, well, let's say in modern society we're very concerned with murder, or let's say terrorist attacks, but we are only concerned with it so much, and like all the news report about it all the time, right? It's not because there is murder and terrorist attacks everywhere, but exactly because there isn't much murder and terrorist attacks. So it's not considered normal in today's society to have a terrorist attack made onto you, or perform a terrorist attack yourself. So it's not normal, right? It's a severe deviation from a normal behavior, let's say. And that's why we notice it, because it's not normal, and we tend to notice what is not normal. Because what is normal for us, it's like, you know, like air. We don't even see it because it's normal. Like if the air is suddenly turned green, you would certainly notice that, right? It's not normal air, it's something different. So that's what I'm saying when I refer to, again, this baseline, longer sort of cycle and smaller scale chaotic thingies on top of it, which we easily notice because we have this larger baseline to compare whatever is happening in the smaller cycle to. All right. Yeah, and probably last note here that I wish to make is that in general, like when we talk about recognition of stuff, like since we already mentioned this, like, you know, cycles within cycles is one picture of the thing, right? But another picture would be this, you know, yin-yang kind of thing, like the sort of dance of the opposites, you know. By the way, I have noticed that in the last, like, maybe 15 years, this symbol yin-yang almost disappeared. Like in the 90s, I can remember clearly, in early 2000s, like it was very popular. You can see it, you could see it everywhere. Like I have no idea what happened to it. Like I can't see it anywhere today, like, which is kind of strange. Like I guess this sort of new age kind of, you know, fascination with the East is kind of over. I don't know, whatever. This exoticism of the 90s. But anyway, so, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, recognition of stuff. So the opposites, let's say. So people say, some people even build like their super progressive philosophy on it that, well, it's not really progressive, obviously, in any sense of the word, that there are opposites that kind of fight each other, and through that, like the whole world sort of evolves, right? Dialectics or whatever. So, well, what I wish to say here is that, well, the idea is kind of stupid because, well, what's the idea behind yin-yang? Well, maybe not the idea behind it, but what it clearly illustrates, in my eyes at least, is that it's kind of pointless to even try to say that the world is made of, let's say, black and white, right? Because the point is that you are arbitrarily, maybe not so, but more or less arbitrarily, divide the world into black and white and try to paint it in this way, right? So it's not that a thing has parts of black and parts of white in it. It's that you are introducing the notions of black and white into the thing, which doesn't even care about black and white in the first place, right? So black and white, this yin and yang, only exist in your head, basically. They might help you, they might hinder you, but whatever, they exist only in your head. The world doesn't care about the opposites, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say through this super stupid sentence is that, well, yeah, like the patterns that we recognize, like these absolutes, you know, like the properties, the qualia, you know, in philosophical sense, don't even exist in the world in the first place, right? We put, or rather, I don't know, we perceive the world through them, perhaps, right? So, and again, it becomes a very trivial statement to say that the world is not black and white. It's like sort of a complex interplay between black and white, right? Well, it's doubly trivial because the world doesn't care about black and white and their interplay. It's you trying to describe the world through your own concepts of black and white that you've introduced into the world, right? Which again doesn't care about them. So, and that's why you get this complexity because, well, that's an interesting angle actually with regards to the topic of the video, that you are actually trying to introduce these simple concepts and then you cannot describe the world with them, with their help, because the world is much more complex inherently and those concepts are not in it in the first place without your help, so to speak, right? Oh, anyway, I feel like it's not getting anywhere really. I guess that would be all. So to conclude, what I was talking about in this video is that oftentimes in complex systems such as society, personal life, I mean, a human being, let's say, economics or whatever, there are processes which are, again, chaotic and complex, but often they are the result of very simple forces just acting themselves, manifesting through the environment. And therefore, there are often really long, large-scale trends behind this smaller scale complexity. And these trends may be recognized and, like, they make good foundations for any sort of, you know, long-term prognostics, etc. At the same time, it might be, what's the word, generalized, and you might say, well, this larger trend, simple trend, underlying the smaller scale chaos, is also a part of an even larger simple trend, but I mean, it's part of a chaos on top of an even larger simple trend, right? So, complexity, behind it we find simplicity, behind it we find another complexity, behind it we find another simplicity, and we arrive at this idea of cycles within cycles, right? Which again is applicable, but it is trivial. Again, for details, see above. All right, I guess that would be all. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.